Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding. You are once again listening to PreserveCast, and we are thrilled today to have an interesting conversation, one that is a little different than we normally do here on PreserveCast. We normally stick to the history, as it were, but in this case, we're going to be talking about something that is history adjacent, but also has just a profound and positive impact on our natural world and a great place where historic places can benefit the natural world. We're going to be talking with Andrew Brown, who's the manager of the Farmland Raptor Program at the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership. And we wanted to have this conversation because I caught wind of the program and noticed how they mentioned that oftentimes this happens in historic barns, and it made a lot of sense to me. And I thought that this would be an interesting conversation, not only for folks here in Maryland, but for people around the country who listen, who maybe are interested in using a historic resource and putting it to good use for the natural world as well. And something just slightly outside of our focus field sometimes gets us thinking about historic places in important and different ways. So before we get there, Andrew, it's good to have you. We don't always talk to people who know about the natural world as much as you do, and certainly don't get a chance to sit down with people who know so much about raptors. We won't be talking about Jurassic Park today, but we will be talking about raptors. But let's talk a little bit about you first. What was sort of your path to doing this? How does someone become an expert in this field and so familiar with these creatures and their needs?
Well, thank you for having me, Nick. And I'm real excited about participating in this program. As you mentioned, these historic sites, these historic farms throughout the state of Maryland are incredibly important for the survivorship of some of these raptors or birds of prey. So I began, I had an innate interest in nature and wildlife from a very, very young age. I remember distinctly, watching the Wonderful World of Disney, Wild Kingdom. I'm kind of dating myself. And National Geographic on Sunday evenings, there was a trio of programming that I never missed. I just had this feeling that this is what I want to do with my life. I want to help animals from a very, very young age. So I pursued, education in wildlife biology from Frostburg State University. And right after graduation, I was employed by Calvert County Natural Resources Division, where I was a naturalist and began doing, lots of nature interpretation, education, environmental education, and some field research. And one of those projects that I started was barn owls in along the Patuxent River Valley in the early 1990s. So that's how I got to where I am today.
And so, how does obviously with raptors, which we're going to be talking about in particular, obviously you go and you study this and you become a naturalist and you start working with it. You obviously, if you're rehoming them and things like that, you have to get comfortable with being around them, perhaps even handling them, things like that. Is that just experience based? How do you get comfortable handling a raptor? How do you get comfortable knowing their movements and what sets them off and what makes them comfortable?
Yeah, pretty much is definitely very much experience based. I was fortunate to have several mentors who had who were experienced in raptor handling. In order to do this type of research, we often put bands on the bird's legs so that we could track them and study their ecology. You have to be trained and licensed by at the time in the early 90s was U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Now it's U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'm sorry, USGS. And so, you apprenticeship under a master bander and learn all the proper techniques of handling them, observing them, and, the ethics behind working with wildlife. So that's how I actually got started. One of my my college friends who was employed by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources over on the Eastern Shore in Wye Mills started a barn owl project in the late 1980s in Dorchester County. So I was lucky to work with him in banding and handling the young barn owl chicks, and then I started this project along the Patuxent River a few years later.
So the Maryland, we'll kind of start big. Excuse me. We'll start big and we'll go a little bit smaller. The Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership. Talk to us about that organization. What's the mission? What's the programs? How does it all work? And what are they focused on?
Yeah, so that's in the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership was established in 2016 as a result of a recent publication by Maryland DNR called the State Wildlife Action Plan. The federal government provides funding for wildlife projects and wildlife resources to each individual state and tribal lands and such. But in order to apply for that grant money, each state needs to produce this document called the State Wildlife Action Plan, and it outlines all of the wildlife species in their jurisdiction, in their state, that are in need of conservation. So there's a list of birds, there's a list of mammals and insects and fish and mollusks and so on. So in 2015, the state of Maryland revised their state wildlife action plan, and members of Maryland DNR and some of the nonprofit agencies, Maryland Ornithological Society, came together and said, well, why don't we put together this organization that will form these partnerships and help advance the conservation efforts of not just state and county and federal agencies, but also non-government agencies, NGOs or organizations, and put them together and act as a liaison to create these partnerships to help, promote the conservation of these bird species that are listed as greatest conservation need. So that's how Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership began. In 2019, I began a new project with barn owls, a morphology study. And so I wanted to pull together other barn owl researchers in the state that who were running nest box programs and to see if they would be interested in participating in this study and come up with some conservation goals, particularly geared towards the Patuxent River Valley. So we had this meeting, and attending the meeting was the executive director of the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership, Mr. Chris Eberly, and he asked if I would be interested in heading up a program, a Maryland Farmland Raptor Program for the MBCP, and adopting these conservation goals that I had put together for the Patuxent River Valley on a statewide basis. So that's how the Farmland Raptor Program began. We had a committee that formed. But we were all pretty much fully employed, and so we essentially for a couple of years just did our own things. The committee members, this collection of researchers. But I retired from Calvert County Natural Resources in 2021 and began to really work full time on the Farmland Raptor Program for NBCP, and now I'm the manager, and we've expanded our work statewide into I think 15 or 16 programs in 15 or 16 counties in Maryland now. And we're still a lot of work to be done, but we've gotten a lot accomplished in the last 4 years.
No, that's an awesome story. I mean, it's kind of cool to see how these things come together and people kind of recognizing a need and then moving into it. Given that so many of our listeners are preservationists and historians and things like that, museum professionals, they may not be as familiar with what a farmland raptor is as you are. So, I sort of joke that we're not talking about Jurassic Park, but for a lot of people, raptor is what they think of. They think of a velociraptor or something
Absolutely.
like that. Talk to us about what a farmland raptor is. What kind of species are these that people might be familiar with, or maybe they've seen them when driving down the highway, or maybe they haven't because they're sort of creatures that kind of hide and only come out at night. Talk to us about the types of birds that you're particularly focused on, and then we'll talk about what the program does and some of these other issues that you're dealing with these species.
Excellent. Yeah, because when we say raptor, we're talking about a bird of prey. So that word raptor actually derives from a Greek word to mean seize or grab. So these birds that are classified as raptors are those that capture their prey with their feet. A lot of times people think, well, raptors, birds of prey, are ones who eat other animals. But if you think about a robin, it eats an earthworm, and that's another animal. So it's really specifically those birds that capture their prey with their feet, and they're equipped with those long, sharp claws called talons. So that mainly involves hawks, eagles, owls, and vultures are those birds that are considered raptors. In that state wildlife action plan that I mentioned before, there are a number of birds of prey that are listed as species of greatest conservation need. Several of those are reliant upon farmland, grassland, or marshland for survival. There are actually 4 individual species that we focus on their conservation work. There are 2 owls and 2 diurnal raptors, or 2 hawks. So the 2 owls are the American barn owl and the short-eared owl. The 2 hawks are the American kestrel, which is our smallest little falcon, and the northern harrier, which used to be called the marsh hawk years ago. So those are the 4 target species that we are working with to try to stabilize their population and reverse their declines. American barn owl has declined by 79% in the last 40 years here in the state of Maryland. And that's pretty significant, nearly 80% decline. An American kestrel has declined by 53% in that same time frame in the last 40 years.
Which that's interesting because, we can maybe dig a little bit into this. These are like the questions you've always wanted to know about birds of prey, but we're always too afraid to ask. So with like a barn owl, obviously barn owls predated barns. But we call them barn owls because they like them. Did they used to just kind of sit in hollow logs, things like that? And is the lack of snags and the lack of, trees that are, old hollow logs that are just sitting around, and the lack of barns increasing that? What's driving that dramatic decrease in their population over that period of time?
Anybody who has talked with me over the years has heard a very common phrase that I mentioned, and it's all about the food. Okay, so the decline in their food sources is what has driven their population numbers to decline. many of the all four of these raptors rely heavily on a particular type of rodent called a meadow vole. Now, it's a VOLE, not a mole, not the guy that makes the tunnels in your yard. Okay, this is a small mouse like a lot of people called it a field mouse, but it has a very short tail and large ears, and I mean small ears and small eyes. But it's very destructive to crops, vineyards and orchards. Extremely devastating crop damage. And so these four raptor species really key in on that one particular type of rodent. So changes in agricultural practices have altered the population of these meadow voles. Meadow voles are primarily found in grasslands, areas of fallow field, hay fields, and pasture lands, and even in marshlands. But advancements in agriculture have changed the way farmers are growing their crops. And so there's new modified plants, beans and corn that are resistant to herbicide and pesticides, and they can plant these fields of beans and corn and spray them heavily with chemicals and eliminate everything in that field except that one particular plant. It becomes a very sterile environment. So there are no insects, there are no other plants that meadow voles feed on, and so forth. So a field of soybeans or a field of corn is actually quite poor habitat. Years ago, before the Maryland tobacco buyout, there were field edges around many of our tobacco fields that were just kind of mowed once a year. They were left kind of tall grass that supported these rodents, and as a result, it supported all the animals that fed on them. When tobacco buyout occurred, all of those farm fields were transitioned over to corn and beans, and in order to get the type of revenue from these corn and bean fields, they had to maximize every square inch of farm field as possible. So crops were planted right up to the forest edge, and the habitat for these birds has dwindled. We all know that human development takes away farmland, rural areas, and you can see when you look at the distribution map of barn owls and kestrels, who are the breeding birds in the state of Maryland of our focus species. You can see that this I-95 corridor that runs all the way from Richmond straight all the way up into New York City is completely absent of nesting of these birds. The loss of the habitat, the loss of the agricultural lands, those fallow fields, the grassland, the pasture. A lot of our pasture, our livestock farmers have converted over to crop farming, because of revenues. There used to be lots more dairy farms in the state of Maryland, particularly central Maryland, than there is today. And a lot of those dairy farms are shifting over to growing crops.
So there's a lot at play here. I mean, it's interesting that not only did the tobacco buyout, which for people who aren't familiar, at one point, I guess late 90s, I think it was, the state of Maryland made the decision to kind of offer all the tobacco farmers in the state, mostly in southern Maryland, they were concentrated there, the ability to stop growing tobacco and be bought out of that. And it had a lot of unintended or unanticipated consequences. This is the first I'd heard of it about the impact on the bird species, but that's fascinating. I'm sure it probably had an impact on butterflies and things like that as well, because in those same strips you were getting milkweed and things like that. But it also had an impact on preservation because the barns, the tobacco barn, one of the iconic architectural resources of Southern Maryland all of a sudden had no use, and so they were being lost and still are being lost at a tremendous rate. I guess maybe a question I would ask for somebody who hears this and maybe isn't attuned with the natural world as much as you are or others are, would say, well, why does this matter? I mean, if there's no voles and there's no barn owls to eat them, what does it matter if barn owls don't exist on the landscape? Will we notice that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And, biological diversity, you hear this, often is biological diversity is an indicator of environmental health. So when you have lots of different organisms living together in a balance in an environment, that is a healthy ecosystem. So if you start removing those individuals and you get down to, just a handful of plants and animals that are left, they are not, they're not capable of sustaining pandemics, endemics, and disease or environmental conditions that would alter the landscape. But when you have a larger diversity, then in the event of those as a result of those events, they can recover more quickly. I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, in that way, diversity is an indicator of environmental health. So, being able to have, a larger diversity, including the voles, including the plants that the voles feed on, and including the animals that feed on the voles, you're getting closer to a natural balance and a clean or good ecosystem.
So the program that you work in, talk to us about what of all these challenges that you've just outlined, what is it addressing? How is it working sort of in a way to try and make a real and substantial impact? What is it that you're doing a part of your Farmland Raptor program?
So, two of the target species that we work with, the American barn owl and the American kestrel, nest in the state of Maryland. The short-eared owl and the northern harrier are very sporadic nesters, but their larger populations spend the winter here with us. So we have different conservation goals for each species. Luckily, barn owl and kestrel are somewhat cavity nesting birds. You mentioned, before the barns were here, the barn owls actually nested in tree cavities, like you mentioned, in holes in cliffs and things of that nature. So they can be easily attracted to nest in a nest box, as is a kestrel also. So one of our biggest projects is to put up these nest boxes to provide, more nesting opportunities, and to bolster the existing population, in areas of critical habitat. So the key is to identify those areas of critical habitat and then put up the nesting structures. So that's kind of the focus of where the nest box project is going. So,
and
how
so
do we
what?
Yeah,
I was going to say what makes critical habitat. So someone listening to this and says, "Well, I have an old barn, and we're not farming our property, so we're not spraying pesticides and stuff like that. And I see all these damn voles all the time. I'd be a perfect place for this. What constitutes sort of the right habitat?"
That's the perfect segue, because we have developed a decision tree that outlines criteria that we use for identifying those critical habitats. Okay, so if there is a barn owl present currently, then obviously that's the right kind of habitat, right? So that would be a priority one for us to get a nesting structure up in that area where the bird is actively already living. Secondly, we focus our nest box placement adjacent or in proximity to active nesting sites. We know that the surrounding habitat is good for them because they're actively nesting there. So then we'll concentrate, placing those boxes in that vicinity. Third is historical nesting locations where they have nested in the past. Researchers in Europe have found that former nesting sites are the first ones that are recolonized by birds, by owls. So we identify those historic nesting sites and evaluate the surrounding area to see if they're still relatively suitable for, and then would place a box there. And then lastly, just picking out places that look like it's the right kind of habitat. Now, what is the right kind of habitat? As I mentioned before, it's grassland, pasture land, marshland. It's quite fascinating. The majority of my work with barn owls has occurred in southern Maryland, and the habitat in southern Maryland is very different than central Maryland. The types of farms, as you mentioned before, those tobacco farms, tobacco was king in southern Maryland. So the majority of those barns and farms there were tobacco, had tobacco barns, and then converted over to cropland. So we have found that the population of owls, barn owls, in southern Maryland along the Patuxent River Valley are preying a little more on a rodent called a marsh rice rat that's found in the marshes of the Patuxent River. So we concentrate our efforts to those old tobacco barns, those abandoned tobacco barns within the proximity of the river, of the marshes in the Patuxent River. Here in central Maryland, the old unused silo is extremely attractive to these birds. They seem to, move across the landscape and inspect these silos on a regular basis, maybe even daily. They roost in them during the day to sleep. And so I think they have a mental map of where these silos are. So we have devised ways of putting a nest box inside of an unused silo, and boom, they start using it right away. So, it's really quite fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it presents a lot of opportunities. I'm sure there's people listening who either have an organization that has some space that could potentially be valuable for this, or they personally do. And one thing that you said that surprised me, I guess, is that you said, proximity to existing nests. So there's not like a sort of a territory scuff that happens, or a scuffle. Like how close can they be near each other, or do they like that kind of community?
Here again, it's all about the food and the richness of their habitat. So we have found these birds nesting within 300 yards of each other, and mainly because there is plenty of food to go around to support multiple nesting pairs. If the food availability were to drop, then they do not tolerate others, and probably the older dominant pair would then run off the younger ones.
So now, in terms of, so obviously, just sort of asking from like the property owner's perspective, it sounds like a lot of what you're describing is making the right environment for a bird to nest in. Do you ever end up placing rehabilitated birds? Do you ever end up taking a bird that maybe was injured and then you're like, I need to find a place for it? Does that happen, or is it more just setting the right environment for a bird to find naturally?
Right. It's more of a, if you build it, they will come kind of approach. The research has shown that, hatch and release programs or reintroduction programs for many species of birds of prey is very, very, has a very, very low success rate. And oftentimes, efforts for barn owls in particular have resulted in just 90% of the released birds being captured and killed and eaten by great horned owls, by another owl species. So it's really not a successful technique to use, for us.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to hear, because I think that and it comes probably from a good place. People want to think, oh my gosh, we'll take this injured bird and we're going to give it a new home, and we sort of anthropomorphize them, I'm sure, and we think about them as little people up there in the trees, and obviously that it doesn't always work out that way. So I guess the follow-up question to that is, if you're doing it this way, what's your success rate? So you've got all these boxes out there. I'm curious the scale. How many have you placed, if you have any sense for that, generally speaking? And then how many actually get filled? Do you fill most of your units? What's your vacancy rate?
So we are currently statewide monitoring about 170 nest boxes for barn owls, which is, not a whole lot when you're thinking about the whole entire state of Maryland. But that number has increased, doubled, as a matter of fact, since 2021, since we first started, doing this really full time. And each year we teeter around 30 to 35% occupancy rate of those. So you're probably looking at, no more than 50 nesting pair of barn owls in the state of Maryland.
And that's in total. That's
in total.
And that counts the naturally nesting pairs that you didn't impact, or no?
There, we find, or we hear of naturally nesting birds, but it's not that many. Maybe another 10%. Annually that we hear about of naturally nesting birds. Naturally nesting birds means they're top priority on our list, and boom, we get a box up. Right,
so you want to sustain them.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
So we've got listeners, all across the country, all across the world, for that matter. Is the situation for raptors and these birds of prey as dire everywhere else? Like, if you were to go to Virginia, if you were to go to Montana, for that matter, is there some species that's in decline, or that needs help like this pretty much all across the globe?
So 30 of the lower 48 states have barn owls listed at some degree of vulnerability for extirpation or extinction in their state. That variation runs between, minor vulnerability to, extreme vulnerability. Here in Maryland, we are listed as an S2. But I think I'm hoping that we kind of get a little bit more protection for them moving forward here. Which is
what would more protection mean? What would that actually mean for the bird?
Yeah,
or in terms of what would that provide?
Right, exactly. That's a very good point. A lot of people are concerned, particularly landowners, if they have an endangered species nesting on their property, that means they'll be limited in what they can do for this on their property. But in actuality, it's the opposite. If we have, there are no laws that prohibit landowners from, plowing their fields and growing their crops and so forth. But if you have an endangered species, there are funding sources that are available to help promote, this type of these types of activities that are, helpful to the environment. You asked about why is this a bad thing if they disappear? But, the application of chemicals on our landscape, is a human threat. We know that. Okay. And it is an expense for a farmer.
Right.
When a farmer can have a barn owl nesting in his unused silo that eats 4,000 to 5,000 meadow voles a year, that's money he could put in his pocket from not having to use pesticides and protection of the environment, not just on his property, but even downstream. So, so there are some real benefits to having.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when DDT got out of the environment, there were many different benefits, and there probably were many people getting sick from DDT exposure, just like there were eagles and all the other things that we hear about. I'm curious, just out of curiosity, since I got you here, on the vole side, since you made such a big point of talking about it's all about the food, which is important to think about when you're thinking about attracting things to your backyard or all those sorts of things, having the natural things that they enjoy. Is anyone going about it from the other direction of trying to reintroduce or increase the voles out there? Are you vole breeding in your spare time?
No, we're not, actually.
No? Okay.
We've discussed it and thought about it, but that probably wouldn't be widely accepted. Because they are so destructive. These rodent populations go through fluctuations and crashes, annually, over a 4 or 5 year span. So we can follow, the predators of those populations that do the same thing, go through, boom and bust kind of types of natural fluctuations. That's something we have. We encourage landowners to practice environmentally, conscious means of farming. Yeah, and to try to take advantage of governmental initiatives that support environmental programs like the CREP program, leaving field edge buffers and things of all that of that nature that help to promote the habitat for grassland birds. Grassland birds are our greatest declining bird species in the world, and so when we can work with landowners to create that kind of habitat, then that is a way of starting at the base, and then you got the habitat, then you'll get the voles, and so forth.
So maybe that's a good segue and a good place to kind of begin to wrap this. Is if someone is listening and maybe they do have a farm, maybe they don't, maybe they just have a 1/4 acre suburban lot, or they live in the city for that matter. What's something that they can do to be sort of more bird conscious? What can they do to help these species beyond checking out your organization, maybe being a supporter? But are there activities that they can do in their own backyard? And then maybe after you answer that, then we can talk about specifically if they have a space that's ideal for these types of boxes, how they might take advantage of that or get in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we talk about the farmland raptors, those 4 species, they rely on large areas of open grassland or open pasture or open marsh for their survival. So, from a backyard standpoint, there's very little that can be done, from for me, for example, I can't put up a nest box in my backyard. It will not be used. It's not the suitable habitat. But there are things that homeowners can do, in terms of limiting the amount of pesticides and toxins that they put on their plants and yards, converting some of these areas of lawn into meadow, that helps grassland birds. It helps, the insects and the butterflies and so forth. So all of that, by just increasing the diversity on your own property, would be beneficial to the area. In terms of, specifically for these 4 species of raptor, we are a fully volunteer organization. We have about 100 volunteers, active volunteers, who are, putting together nest boxes, installing the nest boxes, monitoring them on a weekly basis, reporting the data, and finding new locations to put boxes up and so forth. So we rely on lots of volunteers. So somebody who doesn't have the appropriate habitat might be might have an interest in volunteering or doing some of those activities and tasks that we rely on.
And if there's somebody out there who has the right place, they have a barn, they got 80 acres, it's all meadow, and they're thinking, you know what, I'd like to at least try. What should they do? Should they reach out? We can put a link in the show notes to your website.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's one way. And are you actively
on our website? There is an email address for our Farmland Raptor coordinator. It's FRP_coordinator at marylandbirds.org. And that's that'll get me an email, and we can move there into evaluation. Right.
Go from there.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's a great place, like I said at the lead off, for historic places to think about ways in which they can help, because oftentimes you have a historic place that is a farm, or variety of different ways in which we can think about activating these places, and we think about how we use historic places to make life better in our communities. And one of our communities is the natural community, and how do we make life better using a historic place to support and sustain something that predated even these places. So we will definitely put a link in the show notes to your organization, to this program, and encourage folks to help the birds and help these particular species that need a lot of help. And I just want to thank you as a Marylander for all the work that you're doing out there. This is important to us.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.